Hello, hello, and how are you? I hope you're well. Yes, definitely. Um, what are we up to? We're still reading Rewards and Fairies by Rudyard Kipling, and the next section is called Brother Square Toes. I have no idea based on that heading. And yes, I do have my hair sort of clipped back and looking a bit weird. It's got bits poking out the back and everything because it's so hot and stuffy here at the moment. I checked my phone earlier on and it said that the humidity was 100%. And since it wasn't actually raining at the time, I can only assume that 100% means that it ought to be raining. Because I don't think the air can hold water when it's at 100%. Anyway, so I suppose I better introduce myself unless I give you a very quick reminder of what we had last time. What did we have last time? We had the Mark Lake Witches and the Knife and the Naked Chalk, I think is what we had. Mark Lake Witches was where we met a young lady who was in charge of her father's estate, and she'd been told by everybody if she could go up to London she would get well. And she thought she just had a silly little cough, but we all think that she had tuberculosis, in which case she wasn't likely to get well. But the witches were actually a Frenchman and a local general handyman, I suppose, who was very observant and was also very in tune with what different plants and things could do and what would help this girl's health. So, among other things. Just the way it is. And the Knife and the Naked Chalk was about in the prehistoric settlers of the Downs around that part of England, in Kent, I suppose, or East Sussex, I'm not quite sure which. And it was about how their main enemy was the wolves, and how they dealt with that, including how they actually came by some steel for a knife instead of just having flint as their weapons against the wolves. Sorry, I'm just moving something so I can see what I'm meant to be doing properly. So that was the last two stories, introduced by and coordinated by Puck, as he's basically giving Dan and Una the opportunity to learn about a little of their island nation's history through characters that could easily have been in those time periods. Right, so I'm going to give you a link to the National Trust property, the National Trust website for the property called Bateman's, which is the house that Rudyard Kipling was living in at the time when he wrote both Puck of Pook's Hill and Rewards and Fairies. So I shall put that in here for you. There it is. Initially it just looks like, these are when the opening hours are and stuff like that. But if you scroll down further, it gives you more information about the actual property and various links to other pages with more detail about the actual property and so on. So it's worth having a look around sometime. If you're ever in England, that part of England, you can actually visit and go and see the house and go on walks. They actually have marked walks for parts of the property, including one that they describe as being Puck's Walk or something similar to that. That sort of information. And if you do get the chance to, it's quite interesting to actually go there and have a look around. The background I have behind me at the moment is a photograph from Kipling's study where he wrote the books. So, if you're new here, hi, I'm Jev. I read old-fashioned children's stories, the books that my parents and grandparents read, and I grew up reading as well. I also read other books as well, but that's the starting point. I found it really intriguing when I was growing up because I understood, without having been taught history, I understood aspects of the way people used to live that we don't live anymore. And I realised a lot of that came from the books I had read when I was growing up. Even though they were fiction, they are still set in different time periods, and they're often set in the period that they were written in. A lot of the books I was reading, they weren't all from the author's point of view, an historic book. And so because of that, they just talked about stuff as if it was normal, and so I had to learn what they meant, what they were talking about. I will tend to interrupt myself when I'm reading with that sort of information, things that I've learned along the way or experienced myself, because, I mean, as you can tell from the colour of the hair, I've been around for a while and I've had a range of life experience. I've also lived in England for a while. You might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not actually English. I'm a Kiwi. I live in New Zealand. And, sorry, I'm looking over at my other monitor in the hopes that it will remind me of the things I was going to tell you about. Yes, I interrupt myself. I make mistakes. I get lost in the middle of reading a sentence on a page because ADHD brain, you know, easily distracted. Or I will stop to explain something and I'll know exactly where on the page I was when I start the explanation, but by the time I've finished explaining, it's like, oh dear, and so I have to look for it. So somebody once asked me, what is it like listening to an audiobook? And I said, well, only very, 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 very loosely like an audiobook, much more like a bedtime story or someone reading a story to you, where if you don't understand something, they explain it for you and things like that. A lot more real life. So that sort of thing. That's me. That's the sort of books I read. This is where I live, New Zealand, which for a lot of you will be on the other side of the world or a very long way away from where you live, which is fine. We don't have a problem with that. Sorry, I'm still looking for other bits and pieces on my screen. So, apart from the fact that I need to tell you, make sure you've got something to drink, something to snack on, and somewhere comfortable to sit. This is my water bottle, by the way. We shall start reading. I shall open the lid because it'll be noisy later on if I try and do that when I'm in the middle of concentrating on reading to you. And yes, my throat does get a little bit tickly with reading sometimes. And my other drink, which is kind of a snack as well, is my iced coffee, which is really just coffee out of the coffee machine and cold milk. It's yummy if you like coffee and you don't mind milk. So let's get reading. Rewards and Fairies by Rudyard Kipling. We are now reading the section called, because it doesn't have chapter numbers, the section called Brother Square Toes. And the sections in this book tend to be poem, story section, and then another poem before we go on to the next section. So Brother Square Toes, and we'll find out what that means. I'm not sure. Philadelphia. If you're off to Philadelphia in the morning, you mustn't take my stories for a guide. There's little left indeed of the city you will read of, and all the folk I write about have died. This is the poem. Now few will understand if you mention Talleyrand or remember what his cunning and his skill did. And the cabmen at the wharf do not know Count Zinzendorf, nor the church in Philadelphia he builded. We would say built. It is gone, gone, gone with lost Atlantis. Never say I didn't give you warning. In 1793 'twas there for all to see, but it's not in Philadelphia this morning. If you're off to Philadelphia in the morning, you mustn't go by everything I've said. Bob Bicknell's southern stages have been laid aside for ages, but the Limited will take you there instead. So instead of a stagecoach. Toby Hurt can't be seen at 118 North 2nd Street no matter when you call. 118 North 2nd Street no matter when you call. And I fear you'll search in vain for the wash house down the lane where Pharaoh played the fiddle at the ball. It is gone, gone, gone with Thebes the golden. Never say I didn't give you warning. In 1794 'twas a famous dancing floor, but it's not in Philadelphia this morning. If you're off to Philadelphia in the morning, you must telegraph for rooms at some hotel. You needn't try your luck at Epley's or the Buck, though the father of his country liked them well. It is not the slightest use to inquire for Adam Goose, or to ask where Pastor Medler has removed, so you must treat as out of date the story I relate of the church in Philadelphia he loved so. He is gone, gone, gone with Martin Luther. Never say I didn't give you warning. In 1795 he was, rest his soul, alive, but he's not in Philadelphia this morning. If you're off to Philadelphia this morning, I wish to prove the truth of what I say. I pledge my word you'll find the pleasant land behind, unaltered since Red Jacket rode that way. That's probably the English soldiers. Still the pine woods scent the noon, still the catbird sings his tune, still autumn sets the maple forest blazing, still the grapevine through the dusk flings her soul-compelling musk, still the fireflies in the corn make night amazing. They are there, with earth immortal. Citizens, I give you friendly warning. The things that truly last, when men and times have passed, they are all in Pennsylvania this morning. There you go. So that's more out in the countryside, the last part. Right, we shall get into the story part of today's reading. Brother Squaretoes. It was almost the end of their visit to the seaside. They had turned themselves out of doors while their trunks were being packed and strolled down the downs towards the dull evening sea. The tide was dead low under the chalk cliffs, and the little wrinkled waves grieved among the sands up the coast to New Haven and down the coast to long grey Brighton, whose smoke trailed out across the channel. This is Dan and Una, who are our main characters in this story. They normally stay at the house, which in the story, the house, I'll start that again. The location of where in their story they live is where Rudyard Kipling was writing, which is Bateman's. The description of what that's all like is fairly apparent when you're reading it, which if you listen to Puck of Pook's Hill or read it for yourself, you'll see what I mean. And in the story, they are now down at the south coast. They had been at Bateman's, or the equivalent of Bateman's, and they are now at the south coast. And they were the last time's reading was on the South Downs as part of that. And I'm just looking on the map to see between New Haven and Brighton. Sorry. I'm just seeing if I can get you a picture of where the part of the coast, New Haven. I've been to New Haven. We actually went, oh, there it is, New Haven to Brighton. Ah, I see. And I'm going to just see if I can do you a quick picture that will help you to understand whereabouts they were. Bateman's, National Trust Bateman's is there. Oh, okay. That helps. It does actually. And I shall get that one out of the way, and I shall find you this piece of the coast. No, that button, not that one. And we shall paste it in here, and I shall put a little marker or two on it for you, and then import it into the overlay so you can see it. I'll probably put it on top of where I show in the overlay so you can see it. And yeah, right, save that. No, put something on it. Save. No. We'll be there very shortly, trust me. To me, it seems like it takes an extremely long time to do this, but in actual fact, I've done this so many times, it shouldn't take technically really take a long time. But that's okay, we'll get there. We just need to find the right folder to put it in. Nearly there. I'm surprised I didn't think of doing this one earlier on. It surprises me often how many things I forget. There's a lot to think of when you're doing this sort of stuff. There's a lot of different aspects of it. You think, oh, I need to make sure I'm ready and I've opened up the camera and I've got the microphone working, because you'd be surprised sometimes it doesn't, and all that sort of stuff. And then on top of that, you forget about the fact that you want to show people pictures, and those sort of things. I'll just see if I can put a couple of markers on it for you. Let's make that a different colour. That colour there. Okay, one of those. Nope. Swap those round. Change the size of that to that. Change the thickness of that. It looks a bit better. Right, and we'll go save again. We're very close. And I shall be able to show you where they're actually staying, roughly, on the south coast. Okay, here we go. Import the picture. We shall go picture. No, we shall go this one. No, we won't. We will go picture. But it's a different one. And then I shall find it for you. Gives your brain a chance to get over all that long poetry. Nearly there. Just trying to open up the right folder so I can pull up the picture. That one. Open. Yes, that's the one. Okay. And I shall move it over a bit. So, I've got it on top of where I am. Actually, I'll put it over here, over there properly, because at some stage further on, no, I'll do it this way, and then I'll talk about it with you. Okay, at some stage later on, this will go over to YouTube, and so people over there will want to see it. There is a map marker icon up there, way over there, in front of the bottom of the book actually, which is where Bateman's is. And then this other piece is the south coast of England. I am now going to put it underneath here so that I can show you this way. Right, there's Bateman's house right there in the middle of this green patch, which is the middle of the Weald, which is the clay land in between the North Downs and the South Downs, which we talked about last time, I think. Yes, we did, because we were talking about the knife and the chalk section of the book. Now, that's where the children were in theory living, or at least coming to for part of the year. I think they were living here. And then they were staying on the coast between Brighton and New Haven. And this is all sort of like gravelly, stony coast. They don't have sand on this part of the coast like we do in New Zealand for most of our beaches. To us, a beach means sand. They talk about going to the seaside. And I understood after we moved to England why they talk about going to the seaside, not to the beach, because you're going because of the water that's there, not because of sand. So they are staying somewhere along this coast, up a little bit from the beach itself, but only a little bit. And then this dark green band along here is, as far as I know, is actually the South Downs. And so they're staying right on the edge of these big, broad, sweeping hills, which are the pasture is underlain with chalk as a type of stone, and that's where in the story that we had last time, the prehistoric peoples who had been flint workers were now and farmers were now actually accessing iron weapons and tools, because it was not, and they had to travel up into the Weald, because it talked about them going to the edge of the forest to be able to get the knives. Our main character in the last story we had gone from where he lived out on this open, broad hillsides, sweeping hills with short grazed grasses that the sheep ate, and travelled from there up to the Weald, which was further north than he was used to, and going to the edge of the forest. And he was quite spooked by it, quite creeped out by it, because where he was on the downs, they don't have lots and lots of big trees, because the soil is too shallow to grow big trees. And he was travelling across country to the area where the iron was actually being processed and made into things, and that was in the Weald, which is where you've got the clay, but you've also got bracken grows there very easily, which is used as burnt bracken is used as potash, I think it is, in glassmaking, in early glassmaking in England. Also with glassmaking, they used to use the sands from the green sand strip that runs between the chalk and the Weald as the raw material that was used for glassmaking. Some of the early glassmakers in England were French refugees, the Huguenots, who had come over from France where they were being persecuted. But that's much later in history. In the earlier history, you had the people who were living in the Weald, where you had the big trees that could be burnt, could be turned into charcoal to be able to fire up forges to melt down iron ore to then turn it into iron tools. Quite a long, involved process. Later on, iron had things added to it, which became what we now call steel, which has a totally different set of similar properties, but it has some unique properties that are quite different from iron. And most of the stuff that we use these days, I mean, we talk about corrugated iron roofs. They're not. They're steel roofs. They're corrugated steel, where it's that wavy shape to them. But it can be molded when it's hot, rolled and turned into things. And it has a whole lot of other strength properties and ability to sharpen it and things like that iron doesn't. Iron rusts very readily, things like that. So that's why it talked about in the story that we had last time that he had gone from where he lived on the downs to the edge of the forest and was freaked out by the fact that he was in amongst the forest with these strange people who lived there. And because they stuck to their own groups of people, they would have thought each other quite strange. So now what we're reading is the children are getting ready to go back home after having had a holiday down on the coast, where their father had grown up. And so they've gone down to the shore to get to fill in time while everything else where they're staying is being packed up to go back home. So they're not quite ready to go home. And we're going to find out a little bit more, probably, about English history to do with being down on the seashore, I would imagine. We'll find out shortly, won't we? Sorry, my chair has moved right back again. It tends to roll a little, and I have to unlock my iPad again. And in case you're wondering, it's an iPad mini first generation, and it works for reading books from and downloading them from the internet. But that's about it. Right, Brother Squaretoes. It was almost the end of their visit to the seaside. They had turned themselves out of doors while their trunks were being packed. We use suitcases. They used to use trunks, so it was like a a wooden chest or box, or sometimes heavy card, but quite sizable, and it had everything that you needed in it. Often had strips of metal around it to hold it together, and something that could handle being shipped on a train or on the back of a coach of some sort, or even on a cart. Anyway, we'll carry on. While their trunks were being packed, obviously someone's doing that for them, and strolled over the downs towards the dull evening sea. The tide was dead low under the chalk cliffs, and the little wrinkled waves grieved along the sands up the coast to Newhaven, and down the coast to the long grey Brighton, whose smoke trailed out across the channel, because the houses would have been heated with wood and coal. And they would have also been using wood and coal for their cooking at that stage, probably. And so therefore all the houses produce smoke. And if the wind is going out to sea from the city of Brighton, yes, you would get a streak of smoke rising up and spreading outwards from the city. They walked to the gap where the cliff is only a few feet high. It's actually a place called the Gap, where the ground comes down quite low just above the beach. Where the cliff is only a few feet high, a windlass for hoisting shingle from the beach below stands at the edge of it. The coastguard cottages are a little further on, and an old ship's figurehead of a Turk in a turban stared at them over the wall. "This time tomorrow we shall be at home." "Thank goodness," said Una. "I hate the sea." "I believe it's all right in the middle," said Dan. "The edges are the sorrowful parts." Cordery, the coastguard, came out of the cottage and levelled his telescope at some fishing boats, shut it with a click, and walked away. He grew smaller and smaller along the edge of the cliff, where neat piles of white chalk every few yards show the path, even on the darkest night. "Where's Cordery going?" said Una. "Halfway to Newhaven," said Dan. "Then he'll meet the Newhaven coastguard and turn back. He says if coastguards were done away with, smuggling would start up at once." A voice on the beach under the cliff began to sing. "The moon she shined on Telscombe Tye. On Telscombe Tye that night it was. She saw the smugglers riding by. A very pretty sight it was." Feet scrabbled on the flinty path. A dark, thin-faced man in very neat brown clothes and broad-toed shoes came up, followed by Puck. Very broad-toed shoes. That might be the person that this story's about. "3 Dunkirk boats were standing in," the man went on. "Shh," said Puck. "You'll shock these nice young people." "Oh, shall I? Mille pardon." He shrugged his shoulders almost up to his ears, spread his hands abroad, and jabbered in French. "No comprenez," he said. I'll give it to you in Low German," and he went off in another language, changing his voice and manner so completely that they hardly knew him for the same person. But his dark, beady brown eyes still twinkled merrily in his lean face, and the children felt that they did not suit the straight, plain, snuffy brown coat, brown knee breeches, and broad-brimmed hat. His hair was tied in a short pigtail, which danced wickedly when he turned his head. "Ha' done," said Puck, laughing. "Be one thing or t'other, Pharaoh. French or English or German, no great odds which." "Oh, but it is, though," said Una quickly. "We haven't begun German yet, and we're going back to our French next week." In terms of they're actually learning languages at school, because of the sort of age that they are and time period it is. They did learn languages, but they haven't really got very fluent yet. Most language learning at school tends to be theoretical rather than useful, so that's probably part of it. "Aren't you English?" said Dan. "I heard you singing just now." Sorry, just trying to get rid of the little bug that's wanting to have a sip of my coffee. "Ah, that was the Sussex side of me. Dad, he married a French girl out of Boulogne, and French she stayed till her dying day. She was an Aurette, of course. We Lees mostly marry Aurettes. Haven't you ever come across the saying, Aurettes and Lees, like as 2 peas, what they can't smuggle they'll run overseas?" "Then you are a smuggler," Una cried. "And have you smuggled much?" said Dan. Mr. Lee nodded solemnly. "Mind you," said he, "I don't uphold smuggling for the generality of mankind. Mostly they can't make a do of it. But I was brought up to the trade, d'ye see, in a lawful line of descent on," he waved across the channel, "on both sides the water. 'Twas all in the families, same as fiddlin'. The Aurettes used mostly to run the stuff across from Boulogne, and we Lees landed it here and ran it up to London town by the safest road." "Then where did you live?" said Una. "You mustn't ever live too close to your business in our trade. We kept our little fishing smack at Shoreham, but otherwise we Lees was all honest cottager folk. At Warminghurst, under Washington, Bramber Way, on the old Penn estate." "Ah," said Puck, squatted by the windlass. "I remember a piece about the Lees at Warminghurst, I do. There was never a Lee to Warminghurst that wasn't a gypsy last and first. I reckon that's the truth, Pharaoh." Pharaoh laughed. "Admittin' that's true," he said, "my gypsy blood must be wore pretty thin, for I've made and kept a worldly fortune." "By smuggling?" Dan asked. "I'm just wondering if I should see if I can find this place called Warminghurst. See if it's a real place or if it's another one of Mr. Kipling's imaginary places." Come on. Do your little thing. Come on, browser. Warminghurst. Warminghurst, Pulborough. We'll find out, won't we? And then zoom out. It may not be the same Warminghurst because this is the thing with England. Okay, you remember where we'd seen on the map? I'll show it to you again. Whoop, no, not that one. Map 2, this one here. Okay. Well, we've got Brighton here. If you come further over this way and off the map a bit and up from the coast, north of a place called Worthing, over this way, is where Warminghurst is. So as he said, you don't want to have your business, when you're a smuggler, right next to where you live. And there you go. He doesn't live right next to where his business is. Would involve a lot of riding, I would think, to get there and back. By smuggling? Dan asked. No, in the tobacco trade. You don't mean to say you gave up smuggling just to go and be a tobacconist? Dan looked so disappointed they all had to laugh. Now, tobacco came from the New World, so this is after Columbus has been over there. We'll find out. That may come into our story. Excuse me a minute. Dan looked so disappointed they all had to laugh. I'm sorry, but there's all sorts of tobacconists, Pharaoh replied. How far out now would you call that smack with the patch on her foresail? He pointed to the fishing boats. So a smack is a type of small boat. A scant mile, said Puck after a quick look. Just about. It's 7 fathom under her. That means how deep the water is underneath. A fathom is 6 feet, so it's 7 times 6. So that's 42 feet deep, which is, I don't know, in metres. I can do one or the other. I don't transfer from one to the other, I'm sorry. Anyway, we'll carry on. 7 fathom under her, clean sand. That was where Uncle Aurette used to sink his brandy kegs from Boulogne, and we fished him up and rowed him into the gap here for the ponies to run inland. One thickish night in January of 93, that would be 1893, I would think. I don't think he means 1793. Dad and Uncle Lot and me came over from Shoreham in the smack, and we found Uncle Aurette and the Lestranges, my cousins, waiting for us in their lugger, that's another type of boat, with New Year's presents from mother's folk in Boulogne. I remember Aunt Cecile, she'd sent me a fine new red knitted cap, which I put on then and there, for the French was having their revolution in those days and red caps was all the fashion. Uncle Aurette tells us that they had cut off their King Louis's head, and moreover, the Brest forts had fired on an English man-o'-war. The news wasn't a week old. Brest is a place, B-R-E-S-T. It's on the French coast. That means war again, when we was only just getting used to peace, says Dad. Why can't King George's men and King Louis's men do on their uniforms, and fight it out over our heads? In other words, the actual men directly under those two kings, why don't they directly fight themselves and leave ordinary people out of it? Me too, I wish that, says Uncle Aurette, but there'll be pressing better men than themselves to fight for 'em. The press gangs are out already on our side. You look out for yours. Now, press gang. Do you know what a press gang is? A press gang, when someone has been press ganged, it means basically they've been kidnapped and forced into being a soldier or a sailor or whatever. But not true use of the word kidnapped, because kidnapped means holding for ransom. Whereas when you're press ganged, they take someone by force, whether it is that they get them so drunk that the person flakes out and then they take them somewhere and won't let them go, that's the by force part of it, or whether they hit them over the head and then take them away while they're unconscious and then put them on a ship or put them into somewhere where they can't get out of until they've agreed to actually do the job of being a soldier or a sailor. That's what being press ganged was. And there were people who went around getting soldiers and sailors that way. Well, getting ordinary people and forcing them. And those were called press gangs. There you go. Being pressed into service. Where do we get to? The press gangs are out already on our side. You look out for yours. I'll have to bide ashore and grow cabbages for a bit after I've run this cargo, but I do wish, Dad says, going over the lugger's side with our New Year's presents under his arm and young Lestrange holding the lantern, I just do wish that those folk which make war so easy had to run one cargo a month all this winter. It'd show 'em what honest work means, even though they're smuggling, which isn't really that honest. Well, I've warned ye, says Uncle Aurette. I'll be slipping off now before your revenue cutter comes. Give my love to sister and take care of the kegs. It's thickening to southward. That's the weather is getting bad to the south. I remember him waving to us and young Stephen Lestrange blowing out the lantern. By the time we'd fished up the kegs, the fog came down so thick, Dad judged it risky for me to row him ashore, even though we could hear the ponies stamping on the beach. So he and Uncle Lot took the dinghy and left me in the smack, playing on my fiddle to guide him back. So they rowed ashore and left this guy who's telling the story to play his fiddle, that's like a violin, playing it in the little boat, but not the dinghy, which is the one that you row, so that they could find him again. Presently I heard guns. 2 of them sounded mighty like Uncle Aurette's 3-pounders. He didn't go naked about the seas after dark. That means gunless. Then come more, which I reckoned was Captain Giddens in the revenue cutter. He was open-handed with his compliments, but he would lay his guns himself. I stopped fiddling to listen, and I heard a whole skyful of French up in the fog, and a high bow came down on top of the smack. I hadn't time to call or think. I remembered the smack heeling over and me standing on the gunwale, pushing up against the ship's side as if I hoped to bear her off. Then the square of an open port with a lantern in it slid by in front of my nose. I kicked back on our gunwale just as it went under and slipped through that port into the French ship, me and my fiddle. So his little boat that he was sitting on has just been sunk because they were run over by the French boat. Gracious, said Una, what an adventure. Didn't anybody see you come in, said Dan. There wasn't anyone there. I'd made use of an orlop deck port. That's the next deck below the gun deck, which by rights should not have been open at all. Orlop being one that, if in desperation you have to use oars, originally, if in desperation you had to use oars, those are the little ports, the little openings in the side of the boat that you would put the oars out. Which by rights should not have been open at all. No, at night and in weather like that, and when you're moving the boat around, you don't leave those open, especially if there's any weather going on, because water can come in. The crew was standing by their guns up above. I rolled onto a pile of dunnage in the dark and I went to sleep. When I woke, men was talking all round me, telling each other their names and sorrows, just like Dad told me pressed men used to talk in the last war. Pretty soon I made out they'd all been hove aboard together by the press gangs and left to sort themselves. The ship, she was the Embuscade, a 36-gun Republican frigate. Captain Jean-Baptiste Bompard. 2 days out of Le Havre, going to the United States with a Republican French ambassador of the name of Guinea. They had been up all night clearing for action on account of hearing guns in the fog. Uncle Aurette and Captain Giddens must have been passing the time of day with each other off New Haven, and the frigate had drifted past him. She never knew she'd run down our smack. Seeing so many aboard was total strangers to each other. I thought one more mightn't be noticed. So I put Aunt Cecile's red cap on the back of my head and my hands in my pockets like the rest, and, as we French say, I circulated till I found the galley. "What? Here's one of 'em that isn't sick," says a cook. "Take his breakfast to Citizen Bompard." Yeah, during the French Revolution, the citizens were the people who were the anti royals and lords and all those sort of things, or the French equivalent, because they were taking as much as they could from the ordinary people and demanding lots of work, and they didn't get anything in return, the normal people. And so they had thrown over all of those people, the people who'd been in charge, all the important, supposedly, people, and everyone else was, because it was now a republic, or was becoming a republic, referred to each other as citizens, so on. Take his breakfast to Citizen Bompard. I carried the tray to the cabin, but I didn't call this Bompard citizen. Oh no, Mon Capitaine was my little word, same as Uncle Aurette used to answer in King Louis's navy. Bompard, he liked it. He took me on for cabin servant and asked that no one asked questions. And thus I got good victuals, that's food, good victuals, and light work all the way across to America. He talked a heap of politics, and so did his officers, and when this Ambassador Guinnett got rid of his land stomach, stopped being seasick, and laid down the law after dinner, a rook's parliament was nothing compared to their cabin. I learnt to know most of the men which had worked the French Revolution through waiting at table and hearing talk about him. One of our forecastle 6-pounders was called Danton and t'other Marrot. I used to play the fiddle between them. 6-pounder is a type of gun, one that took a 6-pound cannonball, I would guess, or a 6-pound charge. I'm not sure which one. Anyway, I'll carry on. And they used to name their guns too, yes. Sitting on the capstan, so he'd sit, because he had his fiddle when he came on board, remember? So he'd sit between these two guns on the capstan. A capstan is a cylindrical thing that you put sticks into. Often they're this way, sometimes they're this way, that gets turned and ropes get wound around it to move things. These days you'd use a winch. In those days you used a capstan. And they're big, chunky things. And so he was sitting on top of one when he was playing his fiddle. Day in and day out, Bompard and Monsieur Guinnett talked of what France had done and how the United States was going to join her to finish off the English in this war. Monsieur Guinnett said he'd just about made the United States fight for France. He was a rude common man, but I liked listening. I always helped drink any healths that was proposed, especially Citizen Danton's who'd cut off King Louis's head. And all Englishmen might have been shocked. That's where my French blood saved me. It didn't save me from getting a dose of ship's fever, though, the week before we put Monsieur Guinnett ashore at Charleston, and what was left of me after bleeding and pills took the dumb horrors from living between decks. The surgeon, Carragoon, his name was, kept me down there to help him with his plasters. I was too weak to wait on Bompard. I don't remember much of any account for the next few weeks till I smelled lilacs, and I looked out of the port, and we was moored to a wharf edge, and there was a town of fine gardens and red brick houses and all the green leaves in God's world waiting for me outside. What's this? I said to the sick bay man, old Pierre Tiffane he was. Philadelphia, says Pierre. You've missed it all. We're sailing next week. Because they've been here for long enough, everyone else has been ashore and enjoyed it. This guy's now getting well enough and he's missed it. I just turned round and cried for longing to be among the laylocks. Ashore, I think. If that's your trouble, says old Pierre, you go straight ashore. None'll hinder you. They're all gone mad on these coasts, French and American together. 'Tisn't my notion of war. Pierre was an old King Louis man. My legs was pretty tottly because he's been on the boat so long. But I made shift to go on deck, which was like a fair. The frigate was crowded with fine gentlemen and ladies pouring in and out. They sung and they waved French flags while Captain Bompard and his officers, yes, and some of the men, speechified to all and sundry about war with England. They shouted, "Down with England, down with Washington, hurrah for France and the Republic." I couldn't make much sense of it. I wanted to get out from that crunch of swords and petticoats and sit in a field. One of the gentlemen said to me, "Is that a genuine cap of liberty you're wearing?" 'Twas Aunt Cecile's red one, and pretty near wore out. "Oh, yes," I says, "straight from France." "I'll give you a shilling for it," he says, and with that money in my hand and my fiddle under my arm, I squeezed past the entry port and went ashore. It was like a dream. Meadows, trees, flowers, birds, houses, and people all different. I sat me down in a meadow and fiddled a bit, and then I went in and out of the streets, looking and smelling and touching like a little dog at a fair. Fine folk were sitting on the white stone doorsteps of their houses, and a girl threw me a handful of laylock sprays. That's obviously a type of plant. And when I said merci without thinking, she said she loved the French. They was all the fashion in the city. I saw more tricolour flags in Philadelphia than ever I'd seen in Boulogne, and every one was shouting for war with England. A crowd of folk was cheering after our French ambassador, that same Monsieur Guinett, which we'd left at Charleston. He was a horseback, behaving as if the place belonged to him, and commanding all and sundry to fight the British. But I'd heard that before. I got into a long straight street as wide as the Broil, where gentlemen was racing horses. I'm fond of horses. Nobody hindered him, and a man told me it was called Race Street a purpose for that. Then I followed some black niggers which I'd never seen close before. Sorry about the language, but that's the way it's written, and that was the attitude at the time. But I left him to run after a great proud copper-faced man with feathers in his hair. I left them to run after. So the storyteller is running after the copper-faced man with feathers in his hair and a red blanket trailing behind him. A man told me he was a real Red Indian called Red Jacket, and I followed him into an alleyway off Race Street, by 2nd Street, where there was a fiddle playing. I'm fond of fiddling. The Indian stopped at a baker's shop, Conrad Gerhardt's it was, and bought some sugary cakes. Hearing what the price was, I was going to have some too, but the Indian asked me in English if I was hungry. "Oh, yes," I says. I must have looked a sore scrattle. He opens a door onto a staircase and leads the way up. We walked into a dirty little room full of flutes and fiddles, and a fat man fiddling by the window, in a smell of cheese and medicines fit to knock you down. I was knocked down too, for the fat man jumped up and hit me a smack in the face. I fell against an old spinet covered with pill boxes, and the pills rolled about the floor. The Indian never moved an eyelid. A spinet is like a particularly small upright piano. Very lightweight. Probably easy to be transported, if it's the thing I think it is. Pretty sure it is. How about I look that one up for you? You can write the word down. I should add that to my list of things that you need when you're listening. Pencil and paper. Spinet. S-P-I-N-N-E-T. Let's see if it has 2 T's. Spinet. No, 1 N and 1 T, not 2. Spinet. Spinet, a small harpsichord with the strings set obliquely to the keyboard, popular in the 18th century. The modern name is used. The modern usage of the name is for a small upright piano that doesn't come up very high past the keyboard, whereas a normal upright piano, the top, you've got the keyboard down here, and then the top of the piano here. Whereas a spinet, it's a lot more similar. And the strings go up and down this way or across the back of it like that, instead of being in line with the keyboard, which is what we call a grand piano, has that shape. So in these days it was a harpsichord, which means that the hammers pull or brush past the side of the strings, as opposed to a clavichord where it strikes the strings a little bit like a normal piano, but both of them are not very loud instruments, unlike a piano. A piano is actually called a pianoforte, meaning soft and loud, because it's different in that respect to a clavichord and a harpsichord. Anyway, we'll carry on. So he had a whole lot of bottles of pills that were sitting on top of the spinet on the lid of it. Pick up the pills, the fat man screeches. I started picking them up, hundreds of them, meaning to run off under the Indian's arm, but I came on giddy all over and I sat down. The fat man went back to his fiddling. Toby, says the Indian after quite a while, I brought the boy to be fed, not hit. So the Indian chap seems to be, watches what's going on and then he does something instead of doing something straight away in terms of saying anything about it. What, says Toby, I thought it was Gert Schwankfelder. He put down his fiddle and took a good look at me. Himmel, he says, I have hit the wrong boy. It is not the new boy. Why are you not the new boy? Why are you not Gert Schwankfelder? I don't know, I said. The gentleman in the pink blanket brought me. Says the Indian, he is hungry, Toby. Christians always feed the hungry, so I bring him. You should have said that first, said Toby. He pushed plates at me and the Indian put bread and pork on them and a glass of Madeira wine. I told him I was off the French ship which I had joined on account of my mother being French. That was true enough when you think about it. And besides, I saw that the French were all the fashion in Philadelphia. Toby and the Indian whispered, and I went on picking up the pills. You like pills, eh? Said Toby. No, I says. I've seen our ship's doctor roll too many of them. Pills were made by hand. You take a small quantity of the substance that you have compounded. That means putting together the various parts of it, the things that hold it together, bind it, and the active ingredients. And then you take a small amount of that and then you roll them into balls. Those are pills. And that's how they used to make them, unlike the factories that they're made in these days. That's why he says, I've seen our ship's doctor roll too many of them. Ho, he says, and he shoves 2 bottles at me. What's those? Calomel, I says, and t'other's senna. They're used for 2 different things. And he recognises them because he's been with the ship's doctor. Right, he says, 1 week have I tried to teach Gert Schwankfelder the difference between them, yet he cannot tell. You like to fiddle, he says. He'd just seen my kit on the floor. Oh, yes, said I. Oh, ho, he says, what note is this? Drawing his bow across. He meant it for A, so I told him it was. In other words, it probably wasn't quite as accurate as it should have been, if our storyteller is saying he meant it for. My brother, he says to the Indian, I think this is the hand of Providence. I warned that Gert. If he went to play upon the wharves any more, he would hear from me. Now look at this boy and say what you think. The Indian looked me over whole minutes. There was a musical clock on the wall and dolls came out and hopped while the hours struck. He looked me over all the while they did it. Good, he says at last. This is the Indian chap. Good, this boy is good. Good then, says Toby. Now I shall play my fiddle and you shall sing your hymn, brother. Boy, go down to the bakery and tell them you are young Gert Schwankfelder. That was. The horses are in Davy Jones' locker. If you ask any questions, you shall hear from me. I left him singing hymns and I went down to old Conrad Gerhardt. He wasn't at all surprised when I told him I was young Gert Schwankfelder. That was. He knew Toby. His wife, she walked me into the backyard without a word, and she washed me and cut my hair to the edge of a basin, and she put me to bed, and oh, how I slept. How I slept in that little room behind the oven looking on the flower garden. I didn't know Toby went to the ambuscade that night and bought me off Dr. Carragouin for $12 and a dozen bottles of Seneca oil. Carragouin wanted a new lace to his coat, and he reckoned I hadn't long to live, so he put me down as discharged sick. But he sold him as a slave, basically. I like Toby, said Anna. Who was he, said Puck. Apothecary Tobias Hurt, H-I-R-T-E, Pharaoh replied. 118 2nd Street. The famous Seneca oil man that lived half of every year among the Indians. But let me tell my tale, my own way, same as his brown mare used to go to Lebanon. I'm thinking that means he used to let his horse take him without him telling the horse which way to go. Then why did he keep her in Davy Jones' locker? Dan asked. That was his joke. He kept her under David Jones's hat shop in the Buck Tavern Yard, and his Indian friends kept their ponies there when they visited him. I looked after the horses when I wasn't rolling pills on top of the old spinet while he played his fiddle, and Red Jacket sang hymns. I liked it. I had good victuals, light work, a suit of clean clothes, a plenty music, and quiet, smiling German folk all around that let me sit in their gardens. My first Sunday, Toby took me to his church in Moravian Alley. That was in the garden too. The women wore long-eared caps and handkerchiefs. They came in at one door and the men at another, and there was a brass chandelier you could see your face in, and a dark boy to blow the organ bellows. I carried Toby's fiddle, and he played pretty much as he chose, all against the organ and the singing. He was the only one they let do it, for they were a simple-minded folk. They used to wash each other's feet up in the attic to keep themselves humble, which Lord knows they didn't need. How very queer, said Una. Pharaoh's eyes twinkled. I've met many and seen much, he said, but I haven't yet found any better or quieter or forebaringer people than the brethren and sisterin of the Moravian Church in Philadelphia. And it was a real church type, the Moravians. There you go. They came from Moravia in Germany, I suppose, what became Germany. You can look them up. Nor will I ever forget my first Sunday. The service was in English that week, with the smell of flowers coming in from Pastor Meadows' garden, where the big peach tree is, and me looking at all the clean strangeness and thinking of 'tween decks on the ambuscade only 6 days ago. Being a boy, it seemed to me it had lasted forever and was going on forever, but I didn't know Toby then. As soon as the dancing clock struck midnight that Sunday I was lying under the spinet, I heard Toby's fiddle. He'd just got done his supper, which he always took late and heavy. Gert, says he, get the horses. Liberty and independence forever. The flowers appear upon the earth, and the time of the singing of birds is come. We are going to my country seat in Lebanon. I rubbed my eyes and fetched him out of the Buck stable. Red Jacket was there saddling his, and when I'd packed the saddlebags, we three rode up Race Street to the ferry by starlight. So we went travelling. It's a kindly, softly country there, back of Philadelphia among the German towns, Lancaster way. Little houses and bursting big barns, fat cattle, fat women, and all as peaceful as heaven might be if they farmed there. Toby sold medicines out of his saddlebags and gave the French war news to folk along the roads. Him and his long-hilted umbrella, I think that's umbrella, that's why I went to say it that way, was as well known as the stagecoaches. He took orders for that famous Seneca oil, which he had the secret of from Red Jacket's Indians, and he slept in friends' farmhouses, but he would shut all the windows. So Red Jacket and me slept outside. There's nothing to hurt except snakes, and they slip away quick enough if you thrash in the bushes. I'd have liked that, said Dan. I'd no fault to find with those days. In the cool of the morning the catbird sings. He's something to listen to, and there's a smell of wild grapevine growing in damp hollows which you drop into after long rides in the heat, which is beyond compare for sweetness. So the puffs out of the pine woods of afternoon. Sows the puffs out of the fine wood. Try that again. Sows the puffs out of the pine woods of afternoons. So the heat across the pine woods, as you go through the day, releases the aroma, which is what he's referring to actually appreciating. Come sundown, the frogs strike up, and later on the fireflies dance in the corn. Oh me, the fireflies in the corn. We were a week or 10 days on the road, tacking from one place to another, such as Lancaster, Bethlehem Ephrata, thou Bethlehem Ephrata, quote. No odds, I loved the going about, and so we jogged into dozy little Lebanon by the Blue Mountains, where Toby had a cottage and a garden of all fruits. He come north every year for this wonderful Seneca oil the Seneca Indians made for him. They'd never sell to anyone else, and he doctored him with Von Sweeten pills, which they valued more than their own oil. He could do what he chose with them, and of course he tried to make them Moravians. The Senecas are a seemly, quiet people, and they'd had trouble enough from white men, Americans and English, during the wars, to keep 'em in that walk. They lived on a reservation by themselves, away off by their lake. Toby took me up there, and they treated me as if I was their own blood brother. Red Jacket said the mark of my bare feet in the dust was just like an Indian's, and my style of walking was similar. I know I took to their ways all over. Maybe the gypsy drop in your blood helped you, said Puck. Sometimes I think it did, Pharaoh went on. Anyhow, Red Jacket and Cornplanter, the other Seneca chief, they let me be adopted into the tribe. It's only a compliment, of course, but Toby was angry when I showed up with my face painted. They gave me a side name which means two tongues because, d'ye see, I talked French and English. They had their own opinions, I've heard 'em, about the French and the English and the Americans. They'd suffered from all of 'em during the wars, and they only wished to be left alone. But they thought a heap of the President of the United States. Cornplanter had had dealings with him in some French wars out west when General Washington was only a lad. His being president afterwards made no odds to him. They always called him Big Hand, for he was a large-fisted man, and he was all of their notion of a white chief. Cornplanter would sweep his blanket round him, and after I'd filled his pipe he'd begin. In the old days long ago, when braves were many and blankets were few, Big Hand said, and that's how his stories would go. If Red Jacket agreed to the say-so, he'd trickle a little smoke out of the corners of his mouth. If he didn't, he'd blow through his nostrils. Then Cornplanter'd stop and Red Jacket'd take on. Red Jacket was the better talker of the two. I've laid and listened to him for hours. Oh, they knew General Washington well. Cornplanter used to meet him at Epley's, the great dancing place in the city, before District Marshal William Nichols bought it. They told me he was always glad to see him and he'd hear him out to the end if they had anything on their minds. They had a good deal in those days. I came at it by degrees after I was adopted into the tribe. They talk up in Lebanon and everywhere else that summer was about the French war. The talk up in Lebanon and everyone else that summer was about the French war with England and whether the United States had joined with France or make a peace treaty with England. Toby wanted peace so as he could go about the reservation buying his oils. But most of the white men wished for war, and they was angry because the president wouldn't give the sign for it. The newspaper said men was burning Guy Fawkes' image of General Washington and yelling after him in the streets of Philadelphia. You'd have been astonished what those two fine old chiefs knew of the ins and outs of such matters. The little I've learned of politics I picked up from Cornplanter and Red Jacket on the reservation. Toby used to read the Aurora newspaper. He was what they call a Democrat, though our church is against the brethren concerning themselves with politics. I hate politics too, said Una, and Pharaoh laughed. I might have guessed it, he said, but here's something that isn't politics. One hot evening, late in August, Toby was reading the newspaper on the stoop. That's like the porch. And which I know you North Americans will know, especially if you're from the East Coast, but that's not what we call it in New Zealand. We don't call it a stoop. So that's why I'm explaining it for those who don't know. And Red Jacket was smoking under the peach tree and I was fiddling. Of a sudden, Toby drops his Aurora, that's the newspaper. I'm an oldish man, too fond of my own comforts, he says. I will go to the church which is in Philadelphia. My brother, lend me a spare pony. I must be there tomorrow night. Good, says Red Jacket, looking at the sun. My brother shall be there. I will ride with him and bring back the ponies. I went to pack the saddlebags. Toby had cured me of asking questions. He stopped my fiddling, if I did. Besides, Indians don't ask questions much, and I wanted to be like 'em. When the horses were ready, I jumped up. Get off, says Toby. Stay and mind the cottage till I come back. The Lord has laid this on me, not on you. I wish he hadn't. He powders off down the Lancaster Road, and took off down the Lancaster Road, and I sat on the doorstep wondering after him. When I picked up the paper to wrap his fiddle strings in, I spelled out a piece about the yellow fever being in Philadelphia so dreadful everyone was running away. I was scared, for I was fond of Toby. We never said much to each other, but we fiddled together, and music's as good as talking to them that understand. Did Toby die of yellow fever? Una asked. Not him. There's justice left in the world still. He went down to the city and bled 'em well again in heaps, because that was a medical treatment in those days, was bleeding people. You let a certain amount of blood out, and it was said to cure all sorts of things. It was old medicine. He went down to the city and bled 'em well again in heaps. He sent back word by Red Jacket that if there was war or he died, I was to bring the oils along to the city. But till then I was to go on working in the garden, and Red Jacket was to see me do it, to make sure it happened. Down at heart, all Indians reckon digging a squaw's business. That's their women folk. And neither him nor Corn Planter, when he relieved watch, was a hard taskmaster. We hired a black boy to do our work, and a lazy, grinning runagate he was. When I found Toby didn't die the minute he reached town, why, boy-like, I took him off my mind and went with my Indians again. Oh, those days up north at Canasidago. Don't know. Sorry. Running races and gambling with the Senecas, or bee hunting in the woods or fishing in the lake. Pharaoh sighed and looked across the water. But it's best, he went on suddenly, after the first frosts. You roll out of your blanket and find every leaf left green overnight, and find every leaf left green overnight turned red and yellow, not by trees at a time, but hundreds and hundreds of miles of them, like sunsets splattered upside down. On one of such days the maples was flaming scarlet and gold. The sumac bushes were redder. Corn Planter and Red Jacket came out in full war dress, making the very leaves look silly. Feathered war bonnets, yellow doeskin leggings, fringed and tasselled, red horse blankets and their bridles feathered and shelled and beaded, no bounds. I thought it was war against the British till I saw their faces weren't painted. And they only carried wrist whips. Then I hummed Yankee Doodle at them. They told me they was going to visit Big Hand and find out for sure whether he meant to join the French in fighting the English or make a peace treaty in England. I reckon those two would have gone out on the warpath at a nod from Big Hand, but they knew well if there was a war twixt England and the United States, their tribe would catch it from both parties, same as in all the other wars. They asked me to come along and hold their ponies. That puzzled me because they always put their ponies up at the Buck or Eppleys when they went to see General Washington in the city, and horse holding is a black boy's job. Besides, I wasn't exactly dressed for it. Do you mean you were dressed like an Indian? Dan demanded. Pharaoh looked a little abashed. This didn't happen at Lebanon, he said, but a bit farther north on the reservation, and at that particular moment in time, so far as blanket, hairband, moccasins and sunburn went, there wasn't much odds twixt me and a young Seneca buck. You may laugh. He smoothed down his long-skirted brown coat. But I told you I took to their ways all over. I said nothing, though I was bursting to let out the war whoop like the young men had taught me. No, and don't you let one out here either, said Puck, before Dan could ask. Go on, Brother Square-Toes. Oh, that's right, they did actually refer to his shoes being rather broad across the toe. We went on. Pharaoh's narrow dark eyes gleamed and danced. We went on 40, 50 miles a day for days on end, we three braves, and how a great tall Indian a horseback can carry his war bonnet at a canter through thick timber without brushing a feather beats me. My silly head was banged often enough by low branches, but they slipped through like running elks. We had evening hymn singing every night after they'd blown their pipe smoke to the quarters of the heaven. Where did we go? I'll tell you, but don't blame me if you're no wiser. We took the old war trail from the end of the lake, along the East Susquehanna, through the Nantigo country, right down to Fort Shamokin on the Senachse River. We crossed the Juanita by Fort Granville, got into Shippensburg over the hills by the Outwick Trail, and then to Williams Ferry. It's a bad one. From Williams Ferry across the Shenandoah, over the Blue Mountains, through Ashby's Gap, and so southeast by south from there till we found the president at the back of his own plantation. So that's quite a way. Sorry, I'm just copying some information here that I may need later. Sorry, and I just heard a door open which I wasn't expecting, so it startled me slightly. Carrying on. At the back of his own plantations. I'd hate to be trailed by Indians in earnest. They caught him like a partridge on a stump. After we left our ponies, we scouted forward through a woody piece, and creeping slower and slower, at last, if my moccasins ever slipped, red-jacketed turn and frown. In other words, you've got to be quiet, otherwise you're not with us, basically. We shall carry on. We're getting there. I heard voices, Monsieur Guennet's for choice, long before I saw anything, and we pulled up at the edge of a clearing where some niggers in grey and red liveries was holding horses. So these were black guys who were probably slaves at this stage, and that was their job, was holding the horses or whatever else they had to do. And half a dozen gentlemen, but one was Gennet, were talking among felled timber. I fancy they'd come to see Gennet a piece on his road, for his portmanteau was with him. That means his equivalent of a suitcase, portmanteau, or also known as a portmantle. I hid in between two logs, as near to the company as I be to that old windlass there. I didn't need anybody to show me Big Hand. He stood up, very still, his legs a little apart, listening to Gennet, that French ambassador, which never had more manners than a Bosham tinker. Bosham's a place on the south coast of England, and a tinker is a person who does work on tin things to mend them. They're often travellers, and they're often a little bit not quite naughty, not quite devious, not entirely honest with some of the things that they do. So that's what he's referencing. Never had more manners than a bosom tinker. Gennet was as good as ordering him to declare war on England at once. I had heard that clack before on the ambuscade. He said he'd stir up the whole United States to have war with England, whether Big Hand liked it or not. Big Hand heard him out to the last. I looked behind me, and my two chiefs had vanished like smoke. Says Big Hand, that is very forcibly put, Monsieur Gennet. Citizen, citizen, the fellow spits in. I, at least, am a Republican. Citizen Gennet, he says, you may be sure it will receive my fullest consideration. This seemed to take Citizen Gennet back a piece. He rode off grumbling and never gave his black person a penny. No, gentleman. The others all assembled round Big Hand then. Supposedly, he's into equality of the way people are treated, but he's not treating the person who looked after his horse any better. The others all assembled round Big Hand then, and in their way they said pretty much what Gennet had said. They put it to him. Here was France and England at war, in a manner of speaking, right across the United States stomach, and paying no regards to anyone. The French was searching American ships on pretence that they was helping England, but really for to steal the goods. The English was doing the same, only t'other way round, and besides searching, they was pressing American citizens into their navy to help them fight France, on pretence that those Americans was lawful British subjects. His gentlemen put this very clear to Big Hand. It didn't look to them, they said, as though the United States trying to keep out of the fight was any advantage to her, because she only catched it from both French and English. They said that 9 out of 10 good Americans was crazy to fight the English then and there. They wouldn't say whether that was right or wrong. They only wanted Big Hand to turn it over in his mind. He did, for a while. I saw Red Jacket and Corn Planter watching him from the far side of the clearing, and how they had slipped round there was another mystery. Then Big Hand drew himself up and let his gentleman have it. "Hit him?" Dan asked. "No, nor yet was it what you might call swearing. He blasted him with his natural speech. He asked him 6 times over whether the United States had enough armed ships for any shape or sort of war with anyone. He asked him if they thought she had those ships, to give him those ships, and they looked to the ground as if they expected to find him there. He put it to him whether, setting ships aside, their country, I reckon he gave him good reasons, whether the United States was ready or able to face a new big war, she having but so few years back wound up one against England, and being all holds full of her own troubles. As I said, the strong way he laid it all before him, blasted him, and when he'd done it, it was like a still in the woods after a storm. A little man, but they all looked little, pipes up like a young rook in a blowed-down nest. "Nevertheless, General, it seems you will be compelled to fight England." Quick Big Hand wheels on him and says, "And is there anything in my past which makes you think I am averse to fighting Great Britain?" Everybody laughed, except him. "Oh, General, you mistake us entirely," they says. "I trust so," he says, "but I know my duty. We must have peace with England." "At any price?" says the man with the rook's voice. "At any price," says he word by word. "Our ships will be searched, our citizens will be pressed, but—" "Then what about the Declaration of Independence?" says one. "Deal with facts, not fancies," says Big Hand. "The United States are in no position to fight England." "But think of public opinion," another one starts up. "The feeling in Philadelphia alone is at fever heat." He held up one of his big hands. "Gentlemen," he says. Slow he spoke, but his voice carried far. "I have to think of our country. Let me assure you that the treaty with Great Britain will be made through every city in the Union. Though every city in the Union burn me in effigy." "At any price," the actor-like chap keeps on croaking. "The treaty must be made on Great Britain's own terms. What else can I do?" He turns his back on him, and they looked at each other and slinked off to the horses, leaving him alone, and then I saw he was an old man. Then Red Jacket and Corn Planter rode down the clearing from the far end as though they had just chanced along. Back went Big Hand's shoulders, up went his head, and he stepped forward one single pace with a great deep "Huh!" So pleased he was. Sorry, I'm just finding this picture. That was a statelified meeting to behold. 3 big men, and 2 of them looking like jewelled images among the spattle of gay coloured leaves. I saw my chief's war bonnets sinking together, down and down. Then they made the sign which no Indian makes outside the medicine lodges, a sweep of the right hand just clear of the dust, and an in-bend of the left knee at the same time, and those proud eagle feathers almost touched his boot top. So they are basically the Indian equivalent of bowing to him, honouring him, I think. And I'll carry on reading. "What did it mean?" said Dan. "Mean?" Pharaoh cried. "Why, it's what it's the Sackham's way of sprinkling the sacred cornmeal in front of... Oh, it's a piece of Indian compliment, really, and it signifies that you are a very big chief." So, as I said, we would bow. Theirs was a gesture of sprinkling cornmeal, spreading cornmeal while bending down over the ground, as an offering, I suppose. Big Hand looked down on him. First he says quite softly, "My brothers, I know it is not easy to be a chief." Then his voice grew. "My children," he says, "what is in your minds?" Says Corn Planter, "We came to ask whether there will be war with King George's men, but we have heard what our father has said to his chiefs. We will carry away that talk in our hearts to tell our people." "No," says Big Hand, "leave all that talk behind. It was between white men only. But take this message from me to your people. There will be no war." His gentlemen were waiting, so they didn't delay him. Only Corn Planter says, using his old side name, "Big Hand, did you see us among the timber just now?" "Surely," says he. "You taught me to look behind trees when we were both young." And with that he cantered off. So he knew that they were in the trees listening, is what he's just told them. "Neither of my chiefs spoke till we were back on our ponies again, and a half hour along the homeward trail. Then Corn Planter says to Red Jacket, 'We will have the corn dance this year. There will be no war.' And that was all there was to it." Pharaoh stood up as though he had finished. "Yes," said Puck, rising too. "And what came out of it in the long run?" "Let me get my story my own way," was the answer. "Look, it's later than I thought. That Shoreham Smack's thinking of her supper." The children looked across the darkening channel. A smack had hoisted a lantern and slowly moved west, where Brighton pier lights ran out in a twinkling line, because it used to be a really long pier running out into the sea from Brighton. When they turned round, the gap was empty behind them. "I expect they've packed our trunks by now," said Dan. "This time tomorrow we'll be home." So they've already forgotten what it was, the story was. That's the way it goes. And here is the most famous of poems, and it's part of this story, I think. I'll just check. Yes, it is. And so I'm going to read it, and then we shall stop. "If" by Rudyard Kipling. And this, as I said, is a well-known poem. "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build 'em up with worn-out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will of which says to them, hold on, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Isn't that a great way to finish for today's reading? Have you heard the poem If before? It's often quoted, or it used to be. It used to be one that children learnt when they were at school to recite, because it's a challenge to how you live your life and how you interact with others. Being able to stand clear in yourself without being overbearing, but also being considerate of others. And so we shall finish today's reading there. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to reading to you again next time. Bye.